Welcome to our first virtual lecture about course content. In this lecture, I'm going to reveal some information about Charles Darwin, shown here in a photograph from the 1800s. And we're going to talk about his big ideas, why he is so famous, and how these ideas fundamentally remolded how we think about living organisms. So it represents a sea change in biology. To begin this lecture, I'm going to request something special. So please take a moment to grab a piece of scrap paper and a pen and really write this down. Please record what you already know about these topics. Who was Charles Darwin and why is he famous? How did people explain the origin of species, like species of different types of animals and plants, before Darwin? And number 3, what is natural selection? And let me tell you why I'm asking you to do this. This is a metacognition activity, and it has been shown by research, by educational research, to improve student retention of knowledge. So what you're doing now is recording what, if anything, you know about these 3 questions. And it's okay if you don't have a lot to write down, but I suspect you have some baseline understanding of like who Charles Darwin might be. And then at the end of lecture, we're going to revisit these questions and see if you got your money's worth, if I was able to share more details with you. So I will stop talking for a few seconds and let you write these things down before I continue to the next slide. Go. Feel free to pause the video. All right, hopefully you took enough time to jot down what you already know about those topics. Let me begin by explaining how people understood biology before Darwin. Before Darwin, a popular idea to explain where living things came from is called Plato's theory of forms. And here is an artist's rendition of Plato. He's the guy, the older guy on the left, who looks like he's holding a laptop, except it's a book. And Plato's theories of forms said that types exist. And a type is like a true form, a perfect being. So it would be the perfect maple tree, or the perfect dog, or the perfect human being. And these types exist in some celestial plane such that the variation we see here on Earth among ourselves and among different plants and animals are imperfect deviations of this heavenly ideal. So in this way, before Darwin, people thought variation was imperfection and therefore not very interesting. So people look and behave differently because we're all imperfect reflections of some heavenly ideal prototype. And that's not just true of people, but it's true of all living things. So this was the idea. Under this understanding, Plato's theory, each species was fundamentally different from others. And by that, I mean like lizards were made up of lizard stuff, lizard essence. Dogs are made up of something fundamentally different, whatever dog essence is. Oak trees are made up of oak tree essence. And in that way, living things were not connected, they were considered individual types and very separate from one another. And since organisms that we see on Earth are these imperfect reflections of an ideal heavenly prototype, we wouldn't expect species to change over time. that's very different from how we understand living things today. And our current understanding was made formal by Charles Darwin. So let me explain how we understand biology now after Darwin. Darwin was the first person to formalize the idea that the variation we see within a species is super interesting. So no two people are alike, no two trees are alike, no two wolves are alike, and it's that variation among individuals that he found so interesting. Darwin refuted the idea that there are types, and he is one of the first people to think that all life forms are made up of the same stuff and we're all linked together in a big branching lineage like a family tree. So he came up with this tree of life idea. According to Darwin, if we see two species that have some similar characteristics, they're not the same, like dogs and wolves here, he would say that these might be more closely related than they are to more different types of species. Similarly, Darwin looked at the great apes and saw all of the physical characteristics and behavioral traits that are shared among our closest ape relatives and humans, and he suggested that we are likely cousin species. And this was not a very popular idea at the time. Another interesting piece of Darwin's theory is that he saw living species and he recognized similarities that they shared with extinct species because he studied fossils. So here's a living lizard and a dinosaur fossil, and he recognized that they shared so much in common that maybe there is an ancestor-descendant relationship going on over time connecting living species to ones that used to exist in the past. So he suspected that species, in fact, change over time. And with all of these pieces of a logic puzzle, Darwin came up with the idea that all living things are connected to each other. If we go back far enough in time, we might share a set of great-great-great-great-grandparents. My dog and I are distantly related cousins. Hopefully your mind is blown and that's the most interesting thing you've heard all day. But I wanted to next share a little bit about Darwin's story and explain pieces of evidence that led him to this conclusion, because it's such a famous example within biology. And I wanted to explain first who Charles Darwin is. So, here's a picture of him as a young man. He was the fifth child of a wealthy British doctor, so he was born into the British upper classes of society, but he wasn't the firstborn son, which meant he wasn't going to inherit his father's wealth, and he had to find a socially respectable career. And he struggled in school. He kept a journal, and you can probably find it on Google. He says things like sitting still is difficult. He just wanted to stare out the window instead of focusing on his coursework. And he tried on a lot of different hats. His father sent him to medical school, but he dropped out. He wrote in his journal that he felt queasy when he saw blood, so clearly medical practice was not going to be for him. And he preferred being outside. He collected bugs, and I just picture him frolicking in the forest with a net collecting butterflies instead of studying. And I personally can identify with that because sitting still indoors is challenging for me. So he tried on all these different hats and he dropped out of school, and his father got really frustrated with him, and he said, "Charles, okay, you're going to become a country parson, a member of the British clergy." And this was a last straw. His dad wanted him to be set up with a respectable career, and he sent him to the seminary because he thought that would give him free time to garden and wouldn't be so stressful as perhaps a medical career. Charles didn't like seminary either, and he happened to meet a sea captain, and this sea captain was looking for a member of the upper class to accompany him on a multi-year journey. And so Charles went to his favorite uncle and convinced his uncle that this was a great idea, and he and his uncle, who was his father's older brother, convinced his dad to let him go on this multi-year cruise. And if we look back at naval records, Charles Darwin's title on this cruise was Gentleman Companion, which sounds really funny. So let me explain what that means. The captain of the ship was also a member of the British upper class. And so for him to be stuck on a ship with sailors for many years who were not members of the British upper class, they were working folk, it was thought that the captain wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And so he was going to employ Darwin just to be a dining companion, and they could talk about books and whatever high society people discuss. And so that's very much a reflection of the historical situation in the British class system at that time. So this is how Charles Darwin found himself aboard the HMS Beagle, shown here. And he had very little to do. So he dined with the captain and had conversations with him every night. They, in his journal, he talks about like they did a Bible study. They did a lot of things to pass the time. But while everybody else had a job on the ship, all of the sailors were busy keeping the ship afloat, Darwin didn't have a whole lot to do. So he started collecting specimens. And these specimens, when they got to port, he would ship them back to museums in England. And so that's how he spent his time. It turned out to be a 5-year trip. So imagine a young, healthy guy with 5 years, nothing else to do. He had a lot of time to sit around and think. Well, no wonder he came up with some brilliant ideas. What would you do if you had 5 years with very few responsibilities? No parents, no children to take care of. You're just sitting there with your books, collecting specimens, fishing. So he kept a diary as part of his way to pass time, and he talked about in his diary all the cool creatures he witnessed. Very few people were world travelers in that day, so this was an amazing opportunity for a young guy from England to see South America and Australia. So he saw all these cool, distantly related creatures that were unlike anything he'd ever experienced in England. He also saw new habitats like rainforests, and he found fossils that he would never have seen in England. And combine that with all of his time to think. And so he came up with these ideas that later made him famous. While visiting South America, Darwin made a set of observations that went down in history as foundational to his theory that he became famous for. So I'm going to quickly list them for you. His first observation is that variation is a fundamental property of living organisms. This just means that no two organisms of the same species are identical to one another. No two people are alike. No two, here I'm showing barnacles, no two barnacles are alike. All of these different barnacles drawn here are of the same species, so you can see they have a lot of variation in them. And here's a quote from Darwin himself, and I include some quotes here because it's kind of poetic. So this comes from On the Origin of Species, his famous book. He says that barnacle variation is so great that it is often difficult to determine where one species ends and the next begins. And his idea was that this variation applied to all living organisms, not just barnacles, but here people too, of course. We look around and no two people are identical, not even really identical twins. They have different fingerprints, for example. Darwin's second famous observation is that extinct species resemble living ones. So he saw a set of fossils for the Megatherium here, shown in the bottom pictures, which was a giant ground sloth. And he noticed the bone structures were very similar to those of current day sloths, who are much, much smaller. And he thought, well, maybe these are related creatures. One of them is still alive today. Maybe it's the descendant of the one that is fossilized. So he saw similar species separated in time. Another example that Darwin knew about was the Glyptodon, shown here in the bottom, which is a giant extinct type of armadillo. But you can see all of its armor, which is made up very similarly to the armor of current day armadillos. It's just the scale of the beast was so much bigger back then. But clearly they have a lot of similarities, so Darwin thought they were related somehow. He says, immediately I saw them and thought they must belong to an enormous armadillo, living species of which are so abundant here, meaning he saw the fossils of the Glyptodon. His third famous observation is that there's geographic separation of similar species. So before we talked about fossils being similar to modern day species that are alive, this observation is different because he saw similar species that are all alive today, but they exist in different locations. So here I'm showing two species of rhea, which is a type of big bird in South America, and they don't overlap in their ranges. But looking at them, Darwin thought, well, clearly these are cousin species. They're related, even if they occupy different parts of the landscape. Another example are bird species that he observed on the Galapagos Islands. He noticed that Galapagos birds differed from island to island, but they all resembled a population of mainland birds. So he got the idea that maybe a group of mainland birds was blown out to sea during a storm, ended up on these Galapagos Islands, and stayed there and became slightly different than their ancestors on the mainland. All of this is rather logical. I hope you will agree. Here's some pictures of Galapagos finches, and you can see they differ in color and size and beak shape, which has a lot to do with what they eat. And Darwin says, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. So a paucity of birds means there wasn't many birds, or any, on the Galapagos Islands. Then a small group arrived, and because they started specializing in the habitats in which they built their nest or in the foods that they took advantage of to eat, one species, the original group, had been modified to fit these different aspects of the environment for which they were specializing. That was his idea. His fourth famous observation was just that he knew about selective breeding and that it could change species. Darwin, like Mike Tyson, was a pigeon fancier, meaning he mated pigeons together to give them all sorts of crazy shapes and colors and sizes. So he knew about this and called it artificial selection, when mankind purposely breeds certain individuals together, trying to produce desired traits in the offspring. So here I'm showing one of my favorite species, all these different types of dogs. They were produced by artificial selection on purpose. We sometimes call this human-aided descent with modification. So Darwin's idea, he took it a step further and said, well, what if a similar process is occurring naturally without any human intervention? Here's just a picture of more things that have been artificially selected by mankind. The plant example is really good because you can imagine all of this agricultural technology over many, many centuries, taking a wild plant and purposefully pollinating it, trying to get desired characteristics in the next generation. And that has successfully produced lots of different things that we eat. And then on the left, I show some of those fancy pigeon breeds. I mean, I'm not into that, but some people really dig pigeon fancying. Oh, look at that one with the feathers on its feet, poor thing. It's kind of cute. All right, here's Darwin's fifth famous observation. He had read about it because somebody else, Thomas Malthus, this guy here, another English gentleman, had published on this idea, and he called it the struggle for existence. Malthus's idea that he published is that due to limited resources like food, more babies are born than grow up to survive. That more babies are born than survive to adulthood. And it's the survivors that populate the next generation. So I made this a slightly different color. I don't know if it's showing up on your computer, but this was Darwin's added piece to the puzzle. If it's the survivors that populate the next generation, then maybe generations look differently over time based on who survived the last round. So Darwin mulled all of this over for over 2 decades. And he came up with his idea and then sat on it because he knew it would fly in the face of popular ideas of the time, particularly religious ideas, and he didn't want his family to be made famous for bad reasons, or he didn't want his wife and children to suffer the stigma that he thought would come with publishing some ideas that went against the Church of England. And so he waited for all his children to be grown and settled, and he got his wife's permission, and we know this from their journals. And eventually, he published this now famous book, The Origin of Species, where he outlines his idea. Oh, well, I just gave away the ending. He waited 23 years to publish. Well, why? Because of fear of stigma. And he knew it would fundamentally change the way that we think about biology, and it did. Here's another quote from that book. It struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones destroyed. This is his main idea. We call it natural selection. It is when favorable variations are the ones that survive and populate the next generation. Here is my definition of natural selection. Organisms have heritable variations. Heritable means it's passed from parents to their children. Organisms have these heritable variations that are selectively favored or disfavored based on their effects on reproduction in a given environment. So if there are heritable variations that improve reproductive success, those become more prevalent in a population over time. Let me break that down for you. So let's think about these different levels. There can be an individual, that could be me or you, just one person. And a group of people living in the same place is called a population. These are potentially interbreeding individuals of the same species. So it could be like all adults in Tucson. And that's a little different than thinking about species level ideas, which is like everybody worldwide who you may or may not ever get a chance to meet. So an individual is one organism, a population is a group of potentially interbreeding organisms, and then a species is every single member of that species. So imagine, via selection, some individuals in the population out reproduce others. An example, in my family, my brother has 3 children. I don't have any. So if we're talking about natural selection, his genes are making it into the next generation, and I'm a dead end. In my family example, the next generation of humanity is more likely to look like my brother than me. But imagine that some rare mutation pops up just by random chance. Let's say, I don't know, here people have green hair. And maybe green hair is associated with something beneficial like immunity to coronavirus. If more people with green hair reproduce because maybe they're more likely to survive, then green hair eventually becomes more prevalent in the population over time, and we're talking over generations. So green hair, if we continue this example, here it started off rare when it first showed up in the parental population. There's very few people with green hair. But if it provides a survival benefit such that people with green hair are more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation, what do you think the frequency of hair colors will be in the kids? Hopefully you're with me and you said, well, green hair will become more prevalent, more frequent. And if this keeps going into the grandchildren's generation, more and more people are going to have green hair. Here in our example, we see the distribution of traits changed in this population, with green hair becoming more frequent, and the byproduct of that is that other colors became less frequent. There's nothing wrong with having other colors of hair in this example, except the green one is special. It provided some survival and reproductive benefit so that people with green hair were more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. And this effect, even if it's small, over generations means that green hair would get more and more frequent over time. When a change in the distribution of traits in a population happens over time, we have a special name for that. It's called evolution. That's it. If you've heard of evolution by natural selection before, hopefully now you have a formal definition. Evolution is just any change in the frequency of these traits, in the distribution of these traits within a population over time. And one way that evolution happens, we know, is through natural selection. Like in our green hair example, if a trait, it could be a genetic trait, makes survival and reproduction easier for some individuals than others, they're the ones who populate the next generation. And we know that causes evolution. Let's level up. What do you think is the difference between positive and negative natural selection? When a trait increases in frequency, like green hair, that's an example of positive selection, and it suggests that that trait is probably beneficial in some way. The opposite is negative selection. When a trait decreases in frequency over time, it gets less and less common. This is strong evidence that suggests the trait may be detrimental. So evolution by natural selection can produce organisms that often appear well suited to their environments. Here's a giraffe with a long neck, and giraffes eat leaves on the top branches of trees. Where the leaves are located appears to match the height of the giraffe's and its long neck. Here's some bees in the middle. They eat pollen from the plant, and often pollinators have mouth parts that actually match the flowers that they specialize on. And there's a whale's tail, beautifully suited for navigation in the water. We think that all of these traits resulted from many generations tweaking what the bodies of these animals looked like over time, such that the individuals who had, if there were giraffes, taller and taller necks, they out survived and reproduced their competitors who had shorter necks. And so the result of this over many generations is that we get this nice match between bodies of animals and the environments in which they inhabit. They evolve special traits to meet the unique challenges of their individual environments. All right, so Darwin's big ideas can be broken down. He's famous because he's the first person to formalize the idea that evolution is inevitable. Evolution is the inevitable consequence of natural selection. So if we believe that natural selection is happening, there can be only one outcome, and that's that the distribution of traits in the population may be adjusted over time. He's also famous for his second big idea that evolution can create brand new species. I love this quote from On the Origin of Species because it's so poetic. So let me read it to you. Darwin says, "As buds give rise by growth to fresh buds, and these, if vigorous, branch out and overtop on all sides many a feebler branch, so by generation I believe it has been with the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth, and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications." So when he's talking about its dead and broken branches filling the crust of the earth, that's an allusion to fossils. And the beautiful ramifications mean all the different types of species we see alive today. His other, he has many famous quotes, but here's another one. He says, "Relatedness and succession among closely allied species." So he's talking about species that look alike, like wolves and dogs. He suggests that they are distantly related cousins. Your D2L lesson for this unit is going to reveal some evidence of evolution in fossils, in comparative anatomy, embryology, genetics, and artificial selection. So I won't get into that here, but you'll read about it during your study guide. And that's the first part of this lesson. So please look back at that scrap paper. I hope you did this metacognition activity. And I'll pause now and give you a moment to record what you now know about these 3 questions. Hopefully you learned something new. Feel free to pause the video and write down as many bullet points as you can to reflect on your learning journey that you took throughout this video. The next part of our lesson is brief. I just wanted to take a moment to think about modern implications for society of understanding evolution by natural selection. So if we took a moment, we could brainstorm how we apply this knowledge to medicine, to agriculture, even the law, conservation, which is like trying to conserve natural resources for future generations, so green initiatives. And I believe that understanding evolution by natural selection positively impacts many of these things. But I'd like you to reflect on what you already know. So, in what ways has understanding evolution benefited society, if you can think of any ways? And number two, in what way has an understanding of evolution harmed society? I'll pause now and give you a few moments to jot down your ideas, but you might prefer to pause the video to give yourself more time. If we were in a classroom together, this is where I would pause and hand out paper copies of this unit's case study, which is titled Superbug. And the case study discusses a multi-drug resistant strain of bacteria that was brought to the United States by a woman who had a leg injury while she traveled in India. And she came back to the US and no treatment could save her, and she ended up dying. Spoiler alert, sorry, it's kind of a sad example, but it's rather current just within the last few years, and I invite you to read and reflect on that case study. Another part of the assigned lesson is watching this YouTube video called Why Does Evolution Matter Now? And I will let you do that on your own time, and I'll just continue with my lecture recording. But it talks about multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And so it reveals how an understanding of evolution of the bacteria, the tuberculosis bacteria, can shape public health interventions to try to keep people healthy. Something I don't have a case study for or a video about is the flip side of this. So I wanted to also discuss briefly some harmful effects of understanding evolution. And one example is bioethical concerns. If you have ever heard of eugenics, this was a movement. It's often associated with Nazis in Germany in the 30s and 40s, but it was prevalent in the United States as well. And we like to sweep this part of history under the rug and not think about it because we now know better. But, gosh, nearly 100 years ago now, when people were starting to learn about evolution, the eugenics idea was that humanity could be improved by controlling who reproduced. I cannot begin to express the sadness that this brings to my heart. And this isn't something that was ancient history. Eugenics inspired laws were on the books in certain states as recently as the 1980s. So this is in my lifetime, where women were forcibly sterilized against their will to prevent them from reproducing. And I won't say a whole lot about eugenics, but this would be an excellent topic for your final presentation if you're interested in a really downer topic. But exploring and witnessing, I think it's important to witness this period in our national history. So here I've shown a couple of images to represent eugenics, and on the poster on the left, it says only healthy seeds must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary diseases and unfitness by eugenics. So the idea was you could go to a doctor and be given a thumbs up or a thumbs down whether or not you're worthy to pass your genes on to the next generation. But you can imagine what the doctors valued might not be what everyone values. So who are they to judge? And I'll just put a pin in that. I could talk all day about this. All right, so revisit your notes and record what you now know about the following. And I'm assuming you've already read the case study and watched the tuberculosis video. And I'll pause and give you a moment to jot down if you learned anything new about these two topics, how evolution benefited versus harmed society.